Chapter 10 The Most Famous Man in the World. America. The nation went berserk. Word of Lindbergh's successful flight reached New York City at 5:15 in the afternoon, 45 minutes after he landed in Paris. Minutes after that, thanks to radio, it was known across the country. Horns honked, church bells rang, kids ran up and down the sidewalks, banging pots and pans. Fire companies sounded their sirens and rolled out into the streets to spread the news. People hugged and sobbed and danced and shouted. They tore up their phone books to make confetti and flung it out windows. They waved flags and burst into rousing renditions of the Star-Spangled Banner. They turned up their radios full blast to hear the details, although there was little more to say than that Lindbergh had landed, being broadcast on every station across the country. We just went dippy with joy, recalled one Ohio college student. In Detroit, a tearful but smiling Evangeline Lindbergh came out of her house to greet the crush of reporters in her front yard. "I am proud to be the mother of such a boy," she said simply. At Long Island's Glen Cove Community Hospital, newborn Charles Lindbergh Hurley became the first baby to be named after the hero. And at Harlem's Savoy Ballroom, reveling patrons shouted, "Lindy's done it!" then created a new dance on the spot. Called the Lindy Hop, it quickly became a national craze. The gripping, drawn-out drama of Lindbergh's Atlantic crossing would become, remarked historian Back, one of those shared national experiences that binds a generation until its last member dies. Newspapers struggled to articulate Lindbergh's momentous achievement. The New York Evening World called it the greatest feat of solitary man in the records of the human race, and the North American Review proclaimed the long-awaited joy of humanity at the coming of the first citizen of the world, the first human being truly entitled to give his address as the earth, the first ambassador at large to creation. They gave him another nickname too, the Lone Eagle, a nod to Charles' solitary bravery. It also linked his success to the bald eagle, a national emblem symbolizing the proud independence, strength, and freedom of the United States. Charles's feat had become a matter of civic pride. His was an American victory, and citizens reveled in the knowledge that it had been accomplished through Yankee grit and know-how, not to mention technology. Noted President Calvin Coolidge weeks later, "We are proud that in every particular, the spirit of St. Louis represented American genius and industry in its construction. Still, Most people viewed Lindbergh's triumph as something far more. It was, wrote one reporter, a victory for the entire human race. By this act of pulling himself from one continent to the other, Lindbergh transcended nationality and rose to the level of citizen of the world. And indeed, congratulatory cables arrived from all corners of the globe: Italy, India, Argentina, Japan. The victory of Lindbergh is, above all, a moral victory, editorialized the Paris newspaper Le Petit Journal. He succeeded as much with his soul as with his muscles. America's theologians agreed. That Sunday, in churches all across the country, millions of Americans bowed their heads in thanksgiving. Sermonized one church leader while everyone else jockeyed for money and publicity. This young man simply flew. Declared another, like Lindbergh, it is necessary for us all to discipline the flesh with its appetites and lusts, if the heroic adventure of Christian life is to succeed. Practically overnight, Charles had become a true hero for a generation who'd sworn off true heroes. This wholesome and modest young man who'd flown alone had demonstrated that even in an increasingly shallow age, the individual spirit could still triumph, and his achievement did more than amaze Americans. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote that it made them set down their glasses in country clubs and speakeasies and think of their old best dreams. It had taken just 33 and a half hours for Charles Lindbergh to go from the Flying Kid to the Second Coming. Adulation. I wonder if I really deserve all this, Charles said as he stood on the deck of the USS Memphis. It was June 11th, Charles Lindbergh Day, and 4 Navy destroyers, 2 Army dirigibles, and 88 Army Air Corps planes escorted the Memphis through Chesapeake Bay en route to Washington, D.C., where President Calvin Coolidge, along with members of Congress, top military brass, important business leaders, and 250,000 euphoric Americans waited on the National Mall to honor him. Millions more would be listening on their radios. In the days before Charles's return home, 12,000 miles of telephone wire had been converted to radio use, giving the country its first coast-to-coast broadcast, and practically every American tuned in. It all bewildered Charles. He understood the meaning of his flight for the future of commercial aviation. His was the forerunner of regular air service between the two continents. but the laurels heaped on him in Europe had stunned him. The President of France had awarded him the Legion of Honor, the first time that nation's highest honor had been given to an American. He'd ridden in a parade attended by millions, been given the key to Paris, then traveled to London to meet both the Prime Minister and the royal family. He'd been embarrassed when King George V had pulled him aside and whispered, "Now tell me, Captain Lindbergh, there's one thing I long to know. How did you pee?" Blushing, he'd manage to explain his use of a funnel and an aluminum can. He'd been decorated with the British Air Force Cross pinned with the badge of a Knight of the Order of Leopold, a Belgian award, awarded the London Daily Mail's Gold Cup, and honored with a gold medal from the city of Brussels. He'd received plaques from both the Belgian and the British Royal Aero Clubs, laid wreaths at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Paris, Brussels, and London, and for 16 hours a day attended dinners, receptions, and other ceremonies. From the moment I woke in the morning to when I fell asleep at night, every day was scheduled. He complained, "There was no time for the things I wanted most to do. Walk through the streets of Paris, talk to French pilots, maybe fly some French planes. I did not even have time to be with my spirit of St. Louis. I was a prisoner of the ceremonial life that had been arranged for me." Charles would face far more adulation at home. Americans were clamoring for his return. Already proposals had been put forward in Congress exempting him from paying income taxes for the rest of his life, creating a new Department of Aviation with him as its long-term head, and establishing May 21st, the day he landed in Paris, as a permanent national holiday. While none of these proposals passed, Congress did vote to award him the Congressional Medal of Honor, previously reserved for heroism in combat. At the same time, the United States Postal Service rushed out special airmail stamps depicting the spirit of St. Louis, the first time a stamp had been issued in honor of a living person, and the U.S. Army promoted him to the rank of colonel. Across the country, schools, parks, bridges, streets, and even a mountain peak in Colorado were named after him. A newborn female elk at the Brooklyn Zoo was christened Lindy Lou. A Times Square restaurant featured a Lindbergh sandwich. Novelty companies churned out Lindbergh buttons, flags, plates, ashtrays, stationery, spoons, and other souvenirs by the millions. Music companies cranked out scores of popular songs with titles such as "The Eagle of the USA, and like an angel you flew into everyone's hearts, while ordinary Americans churned out odes and poems in his honor. 5,000 gushing verses such as Willis A. Bufton's American Rhapsody to Lindbergh were published in magazines and newspapers just in the first 3 weeks after his landing. They expressed not only the dizzying heights of the public adoration, but the extent to which Americans identified with him. Once more I stand, America abreast the world, carrying as banner your bright deeds, your glory and your simple pride, the wonder of your virtues, as if they were my own, for they are my own. If the public wasn't writing about him, they were writing to him. Awaiting his return were 100,000 telegrams and cables, 3.5 million letters, mostly from females, and 14,000 packages containing an astonishing array of gifts and mementos. Among the presents were a replica of the Spirit of St. Louis St. Louis carved from soap, an embroidered handbag for his mother, a lifetime pass to all National League baseball games, a dress sword, dozens of Bibles, rings, watches, religious medals, a diamond stick pin, a German Shepherd, a silver chest, automobiles from the Franklin, Ford, and Cadillac LaSalle companies, and a 5-seater monoplane from his friends at Ryan Aircraft. Was it any other Washington, D.C. erupted in a cacophony of church bells, sirens, factory whistles, and car horns when the USS Memphis came alongside the Navy yard dock? "Here comes the boy!" exclaimed the radio broadcaster when Charles stepped onto the gangplank. He stands quiet and unassuming. He looks very serious and awfully nice. "A darn nice boy!" Listeners around the country tensed with excitement. Their hero was home. Meanwhile, crowds waiting at the dock could not contain themselves. When Charles appeared, they surged forward, rushing the Marines who stood with fixed bayonets. Charles was hustled into a waiting car to head under military guard to the Washington Monument. Many people wept. Charles occasionally waved, but mostly he just stared, looking a bit shell-shocked at the cheering mob. When at last he reached the speaking platform, he nodded to the sea of people stretching from the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial. The crowd roared. Then President Calvin Coolidge, after making a brief speech, pinned the distinguished flying cross on the lapel of Charles's plain blue suit He gestured for the flyer to say a few words. Charles leaned into the microphone. It was set too low for him, and the mall fell silent. Most had never heard the sound of his voice. On the evening of May 21st, he began his clipped, reedy voice. I arrived at Le Bourget, France. I was in Paris for a week, in Belgium for a day, and was in London and England for several days. Everywhere I went, I was requested to bring a message home to you. Always the message was the same. You have seen the affection of the people of France for the people of America demonstrated to you. Charles paused before adding, I thank you. He stepped back from the podium. The listeners stood stunned for a moment. That was all he had to say. Charles Lindbergh was obviously as economical with words as he was with plane fuel, but then recalled one eyewitness came long applause. Men and women clapped until their palms were numb. Again, many wept. 2 days later in New York City, Charles rode bareheaded in an open car up Broadway in the biggest ticker tape parade the world had ever seen. 1,800 tons of paper rained down from skyscraper windows, a blizzard of ticker tape, shredded phone books, and confetti so thick that at times some of the more than 4 million people lining the street could not see their hero as he passed. The next morning, city workers cleaned debris from the street that in places stood 5 feet high. And still the parades and dinners and speeches continued. By the end of June, just 2 weeks after his return to the United States, Charles was so heartily sick of people that he was unable to pretend otherwise. He no longer smiled for photographers, and when they begged him to look happier, he refused. He wasn't happy. How could he be? He couldn't take a walk without being mobbed. Crowds formed around any building he was in, and waiters fought over a corn cob left on his plate. His laundry disappeared every time he sent it out, and he couldn't write checks because people kept them instead of cashing them. Girls on the streets flung themselves at him, and once when he was lunching in a restaurant, a middle-aged woman came over and peered into his mouth to see what he was eating. Charles had to admit that since touching down in Paris, he'd felt a strange sense of loss. He couldn't shake the feeling that his success had swallowed up everything he treasured: work, respect, privacy. The life he'd known had vanished. He tried transferring the public's interest in him to his cause, aviation, by only talking about America's need for an airport in every city, or the safety of flight and a future in which people could fly to Europe in mere hours. No one appeared to be listening. Is it true, Colonel, that all That girls don't interest you at all? Asked one reporter just moments after Charles had spoken about his vision of linking countries through commercial aviation. If you can show me what that has to do with aviation, I'll be glad to answer, the pilot snapped back. Now, the most famous man in the world, Charles, was deluged with business proposals to endorse products, speak on stages, star in movies, write newspaper columns, and lend his name to various ventures. A French theatrical agent guaranteed him $250,000 for for five for five appearances in South America. And one Hollywood producer offered $1 million for him to appear in a movie in which he actually got married. Charles said no to most of them. Certainly, he hoped to profit from his flight, but he didn't want anything to do anything that felt cheap or profiteering. So he chose the cleanest, most respectable of the offers. He accepted assignments from the New York Times and the Saturday Evening Post on the strict condition that he wrote about aviation and not himself. He accepted the Orteig Prize of $25,000, and he took on technical consultant positions and stock options in both Pan American Airways and Transcontinental Air Transport, TAT. Commercial airlines were still in their infancy. But Charles firmly believed they were the future, and he wanted to be a part of that. And he took $50,000 from Harry Guggenheim's Fund for the Promotion of Aeronautics. But at the end of July, he would fly to all 48 states as a way of stirring popular interest in aviation while showing how safe it was. Charles also signed a $50,000 book contract with George Putnam of G.P. Putnam's Sons. G.P. Putnam's Sons, that allowed for a ghostwriter to pen a quickie account of his flight. When Charles read the completed manuscript, however, he refused to approve it. The ghostwriter's version, he claimed, made him seem like a dumb Midwestern hayseed. Putnam didn't care. He'd paid for a book and was already publicizing it. So for 3 weeks, Charles locked himself into a suite of rooms in Harry Guggenheim's Long Island estate and worked 14 hours a day to produce the 40,000 words that was specified in his contract. He didn't try for any literary flourishes. Instead, he wrote a terse list-like account of his flight to Paris that included little about his personal life, but plenty about the remarkable performance of his American-made earth inductor compass and his Wright whirlwind engine. Writing the book, he later confessed, was one of the worst tasks he'd ever undertaken, done not for pleasure, but because of obligation. He hoped never to have to write another, but it hardly mattered. The book was published on July 27th under the title We because of Charles's tendency to refer to himself in his plane in the first person plural, and was bought by 190,000 people in less than 6 weeks. Just 4 days after handing the completed manuscript over to Putnam, on July 20th, he set off on his 48-state tour. Over the next 3 months, he threw 23,350 miles, spent 263 hours in the air, visited 82 cities, gave 147 speeches, all on the topic of aviation, was the guest honor at 69 dinners, drove 1,285 miles in parades, and was seen by an estimated 30 million people, an astonishing 1/4 of the nation. When the tour ended, the public idolized him more than ever, and Charles was more miserable. I wish the public would just remember my flight to Paris as something that happened in the past, and then forget about me, he said to Donald Kehoe, an aide assigned to his tour by the Department of Commerce. The two men were hunkered down in a hangar at an airstrip in New Jersey. Through the closed double doors, reporters shouted questions. "Impossible," Kehoe replied. "You're a public figure, and everyone insists on keeping you in the foreground." "I can either be in public life or go back to private life," replied Charles. "It might help aviation if I keep talking about flying, but I think there are more important things to be done." Kehoe asked him what those things were. "I'd like to be free to work on some scientific problems," answered Charles vaguely. He didn't tell Kehoe about his ghostly experience over the Atlantic or how it had gotten him thinking more and more about that nagging question from childhood. What was death? Somehow, although it was still unclear in his mind, his next journey would involve his long fascination with biology and the mysteries of life and death. If man could learn to fly, he remembered thinking at the time, why could he not learn how to live forever?